Correct.
Yes, zooming to you directly from the Deccan itself in Hyderabad. And our contributor today, Amita Kanekar, who is an architectural historian who's written quite a lot about Goa and its architectural legacy and history.
As well as Ikkeri in Malnad region.
Yes.
Yep.
Is also in the Deccan in Goa today, and she will be presenting to us a fantastic contribution on the rise and fall of Goan temples. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our contributor, Amita Kanekar. So Amita, share if you want to share your screen.
Right. Sorry.
We can see you very clearly and your screen quite clearly too.
Yeah, I'll just get it in the right slide. Sorry. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to be talking about my recent research. Recent meaning over the last few years, I've been working on the architecture of the Goan temple. Before that, as Annapurna mentioned, I was working on the Ikkeri Nayakas temples, and a common issue is the heterogeneity in the architecture. The Ikkeri Nayakas perhaps were the first, I think, to have this substantial heterogeneity in their architecture, and a lot of Hindu temples across South Asia followed suit. So this period, the last 500 years, not including the 20th century that much, but before the 500 years before the 20th century really, is a time of a lot of heterogeneity in temple architecture. And the Goan temple really is a good example of this. So I've been looking at it from the point of view of the architecture and the social context that inform this architecture. So I'll be talking about both of these. So this is a Brahmanical temple characterized, as I said, by this unusual heterogeneity. It blends ideas from other Hindu temples outside Goa with architectural ideas from the Renaissance Baroque, probably through Goan churches, and also architectural ideas from Bijapur and the Mughal world, probably via Maratha temples. First of all, this name, the Goan temple, you don't find this name being used by either lay persons or scholars very much, because the Goan temple is an architectural type that has been largely ignored, except for very few scholars. And so this is really a new term. I'm using the term not as a location, in the sense that every temple in Goa, to my mind, is not a Goan temple. A Goan temple is something that is a particular architectural type which arose when Goa became Goa, which means after 1510. Because before that, Goa was really a part. It was divided into and part of many various political, regional political entities. So Goa was born in 1510 when the Portuguese conquered what is known as the Old Conquest. And it's from then onwards that we see a certain change in the architecture, and you have the rise of this temple, which was not seen before. So I'll be discussing the architecture first. So what you see before 1510 in Goa, according to records as well as drawings done by visitors to Goa, is one that we have, in fact, ruins of very few temples in very few pre-1510 ruins in Goa, of which what you see in the top left-hand corner is the Mahadev temple at Tambisurla, which is dated to the 13th century. And it's there may have been there are records of one or two other such examples of temples described as being made of carved black stone, described by the Portuguese who saw them. But the rest have disappeared, and this is the only one that we have of this type. And as you can see, it's of a kind of a familiar architecture, because it's built during the Kadamba rulers part of Goa, and the Kadambas were feudatories of the Chalukyas of Kalyana. And this temple belongs to that family of architecture, which is basically the Karnata Dravida of the Chalukyas. So that is one type of architecture that apparently was clearly here in this region. And besides that, we have drawings and images and descriptions which say that there were lots and lots of shrines, of non-Catholic shrines in this region. And many of them were, as described by documenters, of flimsy materials, lots of wood, lots of thatch, mud, and country-made tiles, but usually palm leaf roofs. And we have a drawing from the Koris Kasanatensi here from 1540, which shows what is described as a human sacrifice next to a pagode. And the pagode, as you can see, seems to be made of mud on a high plinth with some amount of plaster wash or something, and then country tiles. And on the right-hand side, you see an image from Lindstoten, where he's showing a pagode and a mezquita. And this is from the time that he was based in Goa, though he doesn't explain where these are. And what he's showing is a rock cut shrine on the left with a cow and so on. So presumably that is the pagode. And similarly on the right, going by the architecture, we know that this is a mezquita, that is a mosque. Okay, and this architecture of the mosque relates to Kerala mosques, old Kerala mosques, and also to some remains of old mosques in Goa. So this is basically the shrine architecture of Goa when the Portuguese arrived. And as you will see, the architecture of the Goan temple is very different from this. So what are the characteristics of the Goan temple? One is its layout. It has an axial and symmetrical layout, and I'm showing you a Google map image here of the Mangeshi temple at Priol, where we're looking down at the temple complex, and it has a temple tank in front. And as you can see, the main building, okay, has got an entrance on one side, which is under a dome. And it has got a dome at the other end as well, which is over the sanctum. And it has two small domes cutting through at the middle. Okay, so it is an axial layout and symmetrical. And basically the layout is an entrance porch, a hall or mandap, and then the sanctum, which is known as the garbakud. And in between, you may have lobbies. You may have a lobby after the porch, and you can sometimes have a lobby before the porch, before the sanctum. Okay, an interesting thing with this layout, which makes it different from Hindu or Brahmanical temples outside Goa, is that it has what I call a basilican plan. Very much like a basilican, because it's very much like the basilican or Latin cross plan of churches. And you can see here the plan of the Cathedral of Goa, which is of course a much larger and magnificent building, and it has side chapels and so on. But just to show you that the Goan temple, and this is the Shanta Durga temple at Kavare, which is one of the biggest temples in Goa. It has this nave and aisle layout of the mandap, which is very different from non-Goan temples, which are usually have a grid layout of columns, of pillars in the mandapa. Okay, so you see here that there's an entrance porch, a lobby area, and then a hall or the mandap, which is nave and aisles. Okay, and then the sanctum, which has or garbakud, which has its pradakshina around it, and often a slightly larger lobby space in front of it. And then it has a crossing. It has a crossing. All the large temples show this crossing in the sense that there is a kind of a corridor or a passage formed in front of the sanctum, and you have entrances, side entrances into the temple, into this corridor-like space. So it's very much reflective of a church layout, a lot of it. And this crossing, while it's very prominent in the bigger temples, even the smaller temples show a crossing, at least with side entrances. And sometimes the smallest temple might just have one side entrance. The smallest of this kind of temple, okay, might have one, but they usually have some form of a crossing. Okay, so this is the layout which is distinctive. And here you see, here you see images of the layout where you're entering. You have these two rows of pillars, and you have the nave in the middle. And this area of the nave is higher than the aisles, and it's known as the choko or the chok. And some rituals are conducted there. And then you have the sanctum, and in front of it, some priests sit like in other temples, and they do some rituals there as well. So the aisles have got. Earlier, the aisles used to have, if you look at the lowest image with the timber columns, the aisles used to have, apparently in some temples, it was just an open hall. So you had seats on the edges, and it was open to the exterior along the side walls. Then in some of the bigger temples, you can see that there's a grill-like form with timber pillars, with timber posts. And many other temples, I mean, most temples today have a solid wall. Okay, so now to your right, the image on the right is a much smaller temple, what I would call a medium-sized temple, and it has the same pillars, nave and aisles, and you can also see the common roof ceiling form, which is a barrel vault. So there's a barrel vault under a timber roof, and it's higher than the roofing of the aisles. The aisles have semi-barrel vaults normally under lean-to roofs, okay, lean-to roofs with tiles. In some of the temples, the bigger temples, you have a false ceiling made of wood under the barrel vault. These are in some of the richer temples where you also sometimes see timber pillars which could be carved. These are the wealthier temples, and you have this barrel vault. You have this timber ceiling which can be painted, decorated, coffered, and so on. But these are rare. This timber image which you're seeing of Lakshmi Narasimha, this is relatively rare. The very common interior that you see is of the other two temples, that's the Kal Bhairav and the Mahamaya. Other characteristics are pilastered walls, okay, with arched openings, and then a sanctum tower. You have a sanctum tower rising above the Garbhagriha, and topped in the biggest temples with domes, which may be also repeated over the entrance area and over the side entrances, depending. I mean, that's the sign of a very wealthy temple. Some of them just have the dome over the sanctum tower, and in the hierarchy of architecture, there are some which don't have a dome. They have pitched roofs over the sanctum tower, and then there are others which don't have a sanctum tower at all. But these domes are either Bijapuri domes, or most commonly they are Renaissance Baroque domes, actually, and copied from the Church of Divine Providence in Old Goa, right down to the balustrade. The balustrade is a very popular, is a very ubiquitous part of the dome. The finial with its pinnacle can also be, you can have a lantern copied from the church architecture, or you can have the Bijapuri kind of finial. The sanctum tower is usually octagonal in plan, and it has these moldings which reflect, which are, some of them are clearly copied from church architecture, and some of them, like these, the window moldings, are from Bijapuri architecture. They also have typical ancillary structures, including lamp towers, which are, some of them, especially the ones at Ponda. The big temples of Ponda seem to be inspired by Bijapur's minarets. They also have water tanks, and they have water bodies nearby, but some of them have pretty grand water tanks with stepped sides and arched walls around, and so on. This is one of the grandest, actually, of the Lakshmi Narasimha. And these also are somewhat similar in design to the Adil Shahi mosques in Goa, which to my mind were built much before these temples, and therefore probably provided the inspiration. And then they have Nagar Khana gateways, which are clearly from the Mughal world, which are 2 stories high. They have these often have cusped arches, though they may not, I mean, they can have different kinds of arches, but cusped arches are from the Mughal world, and they have this entrance in the lower story, and they have a place for music to be played in the upper story, and that was usually played by by a caste of musicians who are generally considered low. So it's a case of being heard without being seen. So this was the music spot above. So that's the architecture in a nutshell. They also have other buildings, like they have the agrashalas, which are the side buildings, which you can see here behind. So the temple is in a kind of a courtyard, and you can see behind the main temple, you can see a building which used to be the place for pilgrims. I mean, today it's everything. Today it's very commercial. There are marriage halls, there are shops, and so on. But earlier it used to be the place where pilgrims stayed, and also a place for secondary temples. Because these were temple complexes and they usually had multiple shrines. So now the next area of study that I did was about the chronology of the temple. It was commonly believed that this architecture started was born in the 17th century with the Saptakoteshwar of Narwa, simply because this temple has got an inscription which links it to Shivaji, and it basically says this in the Modi script, that in the cyclic year of this day and this date, this temple was founded by Shivaji, that is the Maratha king Shivaji. Now, this inscription was examined critically by P.P. Shirorkar about 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago, and he pointed out that the day and the date don't match. Also, Shivaji could not have been in this area at that time because he was known to be somewhere else. So therefore, and also the paleography of the inscription is not of the time. It belongs to the early 19th century or the late 18th century. So it's definitely not as old as the inscription itself is not as old as the 17th century. So basically the inscription is flawed, but that has been the base of a lot of scholarly statements as well as popular beliefs. I mean, they recently celebrated the 350th anniversary of the temple, going by that date and so on. So that date is wrong. And my own study shows that this temple is probably much later. And I have this because of my examination of images from the 19th century. I think that these temples were built in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, the beginnings are in the second half of the 19th century, and they go up to around the 1930s or 40s. That's the period, or that's the heyday of the Goan temple. And I've used images by Antonio Lopes Mendes, who did an ethnographic study during his visit to Goa in 1862 to 1871. So in which he documented all kinds of things around Goa, but included among them are the images of 21 temples, of which 9 are clearly already Goan temples. I mean, they have the characteristics of the Goan temples, many of them with domes, pilastered walls, that kind of nave and aisles, clearly the layout, the lamp tower, and so on. But a lot of them, the rest of them are not Goan temples. And we in fact know that that some of them which are not Goan temples, or which are partially Goan temples, like you can see in the top left-hand side, you're looking at Marcel, okay, which in fact the layout of the temples today is very similar to this. They're almost in exactly the same. In fact, I think they are in exactly the same position. It's an area where you have a group of temples, but the architecture is very different. Here you can see that some arches and some pilastered walls have come, but there are no domes, and there aren't the grand lamp towers as well, though there is a small lamp tower. So it's on its way. So what we can see is that he sometimes is documenting temples that are on their way to becoming Goan temples. And in the case of one particular example, we have the proof of this, that he has this is the Vetal Maharudra temple in Mulgaon. And he has documented in the top image, you're looking at Lopes Mendes' documentation of it, where you're looking at basically a vernacular kind of construction, a simple, undecorated, not very decorated, at least as far as we can see, but there is a lamp tower and there are some arches. And then, fortunately for us, we have a photograph by Sozai E. Paul in 1889, which is showing the same temple from the same angle and a lot more of Goan temple characteristics. So it's clear that this temple was being renovated in this period between 1863 and 1889. Another, I mean, pretty solid proof of this period being so important to this architecture is that of the Mangesh temple at Priol, which is, by the way, one of the wealthiest and biggest and most embellished and richest temples architecturally. And it's also I mean, this is also connected to the fact that its Mahajans are among the most powerful of the Hindu communities in Goa. Mahajans is a term which is used, which means Mahajan means great people. In Konkani, it's called Mahajan. And Mahajan means basically vis-a-vis the temple, it means the people who are connected to the, I mean, earlier it meant this, people who are connected to the founding or the original builders, or people who contributed financially or made a significant donation or whatever. You could become a great person in connection to the temple. Today, however, legally, a Mahajan means somebody who is the owner of the temple. So you have owners. These are ownership bodies. The Mahajania are the ownership bodies of all temples. All temples in Goa, all the old temples in Goa are private institutions. So they are owned by the Mahajan, and you are a Mahajan if you are a male descendant of that particularly family of Mahajan. Okay, Mahajans. All the male descendants are automatically Mahajans. We'll be coming to this later. So that just explains why this temple is important. And it also has images, okay, from before the 1890s. That's what the temple management says, because they say that the temple was built. If you look at the bottom left-hand side, this image, okay, is the temple after the 1890s. And the temple office, the temple committee says that it was built in this form in the 1890s. If you look at the photographs above, these are images from before the 1890s, but clearly from after the 1850s, because that's when photography entered Goa. So in that period, you had these photographs taken which show the lamp tower exactly the way it is today. Okay, so the lamp tower has been made into a Goan temple lamp tower, but the temple building itself is of a distinct vernacular form. Okay, it's large, it is large, but it has a look like a house. It has either a tile roof or some amount of palm leaf roofing also, as you can see for the eaves. And it does not have arches or pilastered walls or anything like that. So this transformation of one of the most, if not the most powerful temple in Goa happens in the 1890s, which makes it very questionable. This is how the temple looks today, by the way, the top right-hand image, which makes it very questionable whether this temple would have waited so long after, I mean, nearly 2 centuries or 1.5 century after Saptakoteshwar became a Goan temple. This temple would have waited so long to transform itself. What I believe is that although Saptakoteshwar might have been founded at that time of Shivaji, whatever, it could have been founded at that time, this particular architecture probably comes up in the 19th century. And we have then a lot of images and a lot of images of transformation of temples also. Now, these are photographs from the early decades of the 20th century showing temples which have become or are becoming, in the case of the Adwal Pale Vetal at the bottom right-hand side, this is a temple this is a temple complex which is on its way to becoming a very large, it's a very large Goan temple complex, but it shows all the signs. Okay, so this is about the chronology of how it arose, and then the question of its disappearance, which is what actually my first area of study. This temple is disappearing. This temple type is disappearing. It had this very brief heyday, I would say 1850s to around 1940s or so, and around the 1940s, a decline starts, which has only picked up speed. And we are in a situation today where if you visit a temple, a Goan temple, you could go again in a couple of months and it's just disappeared. It's just disappeared off the face of the earth, and construction is going on. Or if you visit after 6 months, a whole new temple is standing in its place. There's been tremendous, there's an exhilarated removal of these temples and their replacement by other temple forms. So this is one of the first temples that was replaced, and this is in the 1940s. So at that time in the 1940s, there are some examples of replacement. I mean, actually, this is the only example of replacement, but there are some examples also of new temples that are built in the 1940s, and they show what I would call an Indo-Saracenic style of architecture. So you're looking on the top left at this Vitthal temple in Karapur, which is a Goan temple type, okay, with this double roof pattern, with a porch, with a sanctum tower, and it has a conical pitched roof. Okay, but this temple is now transformed in 1945 into this, what you can see the whole temple to the right and at the bottom. This is the Vitthal temple of today, which is basically an RCC building. So, reinforced cement concrete becomes the material of choice in Goa for all construction from the 1920s and 30s, and definitely picks up hugely in the 1950s. So these temples that are built after that are using a lot of cement concrete. But look at the form. The form is as they themselves claimed, it's Rajasthani Mughal, or it's Mughal Rajasthani, and it's using so a lot of Mughal elements, the jarokas, the cusped dome, bangaldar windows, and so on, in an RCC building. So this was the first. So I'll just show you the images, and then you have a second period, which is post 61, which is 1961 is when Goa is annexed by India. So now in Indian Goa, there's a huge acceleration of the decline, as I mentioned, of this Goan temple type. So you have here the Mahalakshmi temple of Panjim, and top left is its original form. It was built, this we have a record of when it was built. It was built in the 19th century, and it was rebuilt into this form that you see in 1870s. So this is an example of a temple that is clearly fitting into the temple chronology that I mentioned. It's 1870s, and then in the 1980s, it is rebuilt into an RCC building, which looks like this, and it has a Nagara sanctum tower, that is the typical North Indian sanctum tower, and it has all kinds of moldings and details which are from archaic Indian temple forms. Okay, so this is the second phase of the decline, which is where you have a lot of examples of temples taking up archaic, being rebuilt, temples being broken and being replaced by archaic Indian forms. So just to explain, and finally we have the third phase where you get a four-Goan extravaganza, basically. Okay, to explain what I'm the context for this, this 1940s is the time when Indian nationalism is entering Goa, and there's lots of talk about how, you know, we are proud Indians and we should fight the Portuguese and whatever. So the nationalism of the Indian variety is entering Goa. Now, the architecture of the Goan temple, to my mind, also speaks of nationalism, but it speaks of Goan nationalism. Okay, and it speaks especially of the rise of a new community. I mean, it's not a new community. The Saraswats, that is the Goa's dominant Brahmin community. They are not a new community. I'm just showing you. These are mostly Saraswat temples, as documented by Lopes Mendes. They are not a new community. They were very powerful under the Portuguese. They were, in fact, the pillars of the Estado. But in the 19th century, they became even more wealthy and prosperous, even outside Goa. And it's my belief that and a second factor is that the Goan temples become regulated by the government because of accusations of misappropriation of funds and so on during the long 19th century. There are increasing fights within temple bodies. The result is that the government starts codifying how temples are supposed to be run, who are the people involved, what are their responsibilities. And in this codification and putting down of regulations, they put down the Mahazans as the owners of the temple, which they were never supposed to. I mean, it was never so clear earlier. And who are the Mahazans? You find that almost, not all, but a good majority of the temples in Goa have Saraswats, that's the leading Brahmin community of Goa, as the Mahazans. There are some, the most powerful temples are purely Saraswat. They are only Saraswats in their ownership, and the others will have partial ownership by Saraswats. Now, and there's this rebuilding of temples happening at that time, probably because there is a certain sense of pride, of and of ownership, and also the fact that they are now in charge. Okay, so it's a moment of arrival, so to speak, and as a result, I think there was this attempt to show themselves as wealthy, progressive, modern, okay, in that sense, and also cosmopolitan. Okay, this is what I think is the social context of the Goan temple. And now what you find is that Indian nationalism enters Goa in the, really the 1930s onwards, but by the 1940s, it's pretty strong. And so the temples that are built at this time are Indo-Saracenic, maybe inspired by British Indo-Saracenic, or maybe directly inspired by Mughal or Rajasthani architecture, or one building in another temple is claims to be inspired by the Golden Temple of Amritsar. But what they're doing is that they're retaining the Islamic aspects of the architecture, but they're leaving out the European. Okay, so Europe is left out, and now it's Indian in the sense of being Indo-Islamic. And with Goa becoming a part of India, being annexed by India, what you have is the Islamic is dismissed, and henceforth Goan temples will be replaced by archaic Indian temple forms. Okay, so this is connected to the nature, to my mind, of Indian nationalism, where Indian nationalism has always been close to Hindu ideas, cultural ideas, upper caste Hindu cultural ideas. And in that sense, although this was never, it may have been said, but it was always felt, I think, and in some cases it was said as well, that, that India is a Hindu land. And I'm not talking about the era of the BJP today. I'm talking about even earlier, even in the 19th century, the ideal Goan citizen is an upper caste Hindu male. But basically, upper caste, dominant caste Hindu ideas have been closely woven in with Indian nationalism. Now, of course, they couldn't be more blatant, but they were always there. And as a result, there's been almost a shame among Goan Hindus about their temple architecture. I asked in one temple, there's one temple where they did some renovation and the old temple architecture is there, but they removed the dome and they replaced it with a cone. And I asked them, why do you replace it? And he said, the dome is Muslim. So it was straightforward. The dome is Muslim. So we need to have Hindu forms. Basically, the Goan temple was not Hindu enough. And now it's being replaced by very clear, what is considered to be very clear Hindu forms. So this was what was happening. And with the rise of the BJP to power, even at the state level in the 1990s, this speeded up. Okay, this replacement of the old temples by new forms speeded up. However, something else happened at the same time, which is that mass tourism exploded in Goa, and Goa was transformed into the European holiday paradise of India. Okay, a huge right from that time, a huge number of Goa was always there were always some extent tourists in Goa, but this explosion of tourism happened in the 1990s, and it's just growing apace. And with that, when you want to sell this place as being European, the architecture plays a big role in that sale. And so in what's known as Indo-European architecture, which is, just a construct, it's a fake thing. It's basically Goan architecture. But what they call Indo-European architecture is a big part of this packaging of Goa. And so the architecture, which was of these new temples, the rebuilt temple, which was moving towards imitating archaic Hindu shrines, now start doing this kind of for Goan, semi-Indian extravaganzas, where they have domes and they have things from other parts of India. Look at this one. They have things from all kinds of elements. These are another two temples, where this is the old temple on the top. On the top, you see the old temples, and below you see what they have become or are becoming. So now you see temples are being built with domes. Only those domes are not Goan domes. You almost never see a Goan dome. What you see are either replications of very often replications of Buddhist domes, or you have sometimes, Mughal-like domes, but usually, I mean, then they're almost never, I've never seen a proper Goan dome. And then you have lots of other imagery and, replicas of other elements from Hindu temple architecture outside Goa. So you have this kind of extravaganzas, temple extravaganzas, and so many temples are doing this, and they're expanding in size and scale and lavish materials and this kind of architecture. Okay, so this is the disappearance. Another thing that I've been looking at is the conflicts and related to this architecture. The temples are in the middle of a lot of conflicts, which is actually reflected in the architecture. That one is that they are, like I said, the dominant caste of Goa, the caste known as the Saraswats, claim ownership over a lot of the temples in Goa, and especially the biggest temples in Goa. And that has been challenged. That has never been a smooth run for them. They've been challenged legally in the past, even under the Portuguese. And they're challenged even now. Even now, there are a case of two. So what they claim is that there was a flight of deities. That is, the old temples were broken in the old conquests under the Portuguese, but the deities, the idols, were saved and they were taken to other areas in the new conquest where these temples came up. And so basically it's the Saraswats who managed to rescue their idols and build new temples to them. Challenging this are local village communities who are usually not of dominant castes. They are non-Brahmin usually, and they claim in some cases that these temples and their deities are theirs and existed before the Saraswats arrived, and the Saraswats have usurped them. Okay, so there are these fights and these claims and counterclaims. What is all, and you do have some proof of this in the sense that the Shantadurga temple, which is one of the biggest temples in Goa, it actually claims itself to be located on what was earlier a Mahar community settlement, which they say was gifted to them by the Mahar community. And they also have a tiny shrine within the premises, which belongs to the Mahar community. And they say that this is a case of communities living together and so on. But the Mahar community was never allowed ordinarily into the Shantadurga temple. But they have a day, and they're very proud of it. Even today, they're very proud of it. They have a day when the Mahars are allowed in, and they are felicitated, they're honored, whatever. And then they leave, and the next day the temple is kept closed, and the whole place is put through what they call Shuddhi. Shuddhi, that means it is purified. So you have an example of very clear-cut untouchability. You have a lot of, these temples are actually the embodiment of Goan caste society, right from their ownership and control to their access, to their functioning, and of course to their architecture. That is, the biggest temples and the grandest architecture is seen in the temples of the dominant castes. And there's a hierarchy in the architecture. Less and less of these elements will be seen in temples of the so-called lower caste, and even less, or there's almost an invisibilization of the shrines of the communities that are considered to be the lowest. So you have that hierarchy. You also have a hierarchy of access, that the Garbhakud can only be accessed by the so-called upper castes. Okay, and other castes have to stay out. And certain communities cannot even enter the Chowk area, and that continues in the sense that these temples have become tourist sites today, and people from all over India and even outside visit them. So obviously they are not enforcing such stringent caste rules, in the sense that you cannot enter, nobody can enter the sanctum except for the so-called Mazans, who tend to be dominant caste. But at the village level, where everybody knows everybody, these caste rules are still in place. And I know communities who are considered to be low, who even today do not enter the main temple of their village, so they are in place. They are also expected to do the caste jobs. There are these fights going on where temples claim that this community, which was supposed to beat the drums, is no longer beating the drums, and so we want to throw them out of the land where they stay, because that belonged to the temple. Okay, and this is a very questionable thing because they were never paid to beat the drums. It was a tradition. And so, I mean, the government could take the stand that, listen, I mean, you cannot throw them out. They've been living, the families have been living there for centuries, but the government is not taking such a clear-cut stand, and these disputes are going on. Okay, so caste discrimination, untouchability is a very live issue in these temples. But at the same time, what you also see is that the non-Brahmin temples are becoming Brahminized. So they are, on the one hand, fighting with the Brahmin communities, but they're also themselves Brahminizing in the sense that they have changed their names. For example, the dominant goddess of Goa was Sateri, worshipped as an anthill. Okay, very clearly, I mean, very apparently an aboriginal deity. Okay, and many of these temples had this anthill in the sanctum where in front of it they might have had a mask. That those anthills have been removed in this last 50 years or so. Many of them have been removed and replaced by a idol, by a statue. With also the name has been removed. The name was Sateri, the most common, and she's a goddess who's to be seen as part of practically every temple, at least in a secondary shrine. Sateri was the goddess of Goa, but her name has been changed to Shanta Durga. So more and more you see Shanta Durga in lots of places, though Sateri still exists as a name. It's not gone, but it's going. So names are changing. Kelbai was another popular name, and I found that a Kelbai name had recently become Gajanta Lakshmi. So you have names which are changing. Shanta Durga is a name which appears in the 18th century with this Shanta Durga of Kaule, which was earlier on the record as Sateri. It is transformed in Shanta Durga. So there's a Brahminization process taking place of a lot of aspects of these temples, and there's also control which has gone more and more into the hands of Brahmins. There were also some of these temples which were not Brahmin owned, or even which are later became Brahmin owned. Many of them had priests who are not Brahmins, priests who are local, belong to local communities, and there were even legal battles, in the last 50 years about the priest being removed and a person from the Brahmin community, the typical Bhatt, the typical Bhatt community taking their place, and people have gone to court against this, but the Brahmins have won. So there's a lot of conflict because these temples, even in their architecture, are close to power and also to community identity. So you can see here that that you see the architectural hierarchy. This is just one example. This is the Vetal temple at Advalpale. So you have the main temple on the top left hand side. You're looking at the main temple in front of you, and on the side there are I'll be looking at this image again, but you can see overlapping with it is an image of the Maringan shrine. So look at the distance. This is also a shrine which has some stone idols in this box which is embedded in the wall. So this is a shrine, and this big building is the shrine. Both of them are shrines, but look at the size difference. So similarly, this is now the Maringan shrine. The Maringan is the shrine, traditional shrine connected to the Mahar community, and it's present in a lot of temples, and it's always in a very, very humble architectural form. So this at the bottom right, you're looking at the rebuilding of a temple in Perne, the Baradi temple in Perne, and next to it is its Marangan shrine overlapping with it, and that is in fact might be the grandest form of that shrine in traditional times. In today's times, these Maringan shrines might be improved slightly not by increasing their scale, but at least at the top right you're looking at the Maringan shrine of the Shanta Durga of Bicholi, and it's been rebuilt in granite. So the material is posh, but the scale is still tiny. And here you have a classic case of untouchability in two temples that were rebuilt recently. So you have the Nagara form of the Brahma Karmali temple in Nagargaon, and you have this Goan form of the Larai temple in Shirgaon. So they both have been rebuilt in the last 20 years, but they have retained a double tank. Both of them have a double tank, you can see next to them, and that double tank, one is for the untouchables and one is for the touchables. Okay, and it continues to this day. So untouchability and caste is absolutely at the heart of these temples and their architecture. This is about this. This is a temple This is a temple which is being rebuilt. The Sateri temple of Ibrahimpur, and it's about the slide is about the caste services. People are fighting. Communities in this village are fighting against being forced to beat the drums for the temple, while the temple, whose Mahajans are the dominant community in the village, are saying that you either beat the drums or you get out of your houses because your houses are on temple land. So temples are also connected to land and domestic architecture in a big way. And this is the signboard of this temple, where it says that this is the Deul Wado, which means temple ward, and it mentions 3 shrines. There are actually 4 shrines there, 4 separate buildings, but the board ignores the Maringan temple, which is also behind the other 3 shrines. Okay, so you have 4 shrines there, but the Maringan is not mentioned. So it's a case of the missing temple. Finally, what I'm working on right now, and I'll end with this, is variation, where basically I'm looking at things which I have already mentioned, that you have 2 kinds of variation. One is within the multi-shrine temple complex, and the other is between 2 different temples or 2 different temple complexes. And it's in 2 ways which go together. One is size, and the second is architectural character, in which the temples vary from the whole Goan temple vocabulary to purely vernacular forms. Okay, so you have a range, and all of this variation seems to be based on caste, which gets mixed up with the region at times. So, for example, there's more use of timber in the areas of Sangye, Konkan, and Ponda. But even here, with the dominant caste temples, you have polished timber, carved timber, the Saraswat temples, especially in Ponda, while with the non-Brahmin community temples, it's generally simple, unfinished timber. You also have the most elaborate minaret-like lamp towers in the Saraswat temples of Ponda. While say just in Ponda itself, the non-Brahmin temples, some of them don't even have a lamp tower. Okay, while say the dominant caste temples outside Ponda often have simpler lamp towers. They definitely have lamp towers, but they're simpler. And you have the most vernacular forms in Sangye. So here's an example this is the same example that I showed you earlier, where you're looking at the dominant caste temple in one temple complex. You're looking at the dominant caste temple in the center, and on the side there are multiple temples, all of which belong to so-called lesser dominant communities, and they mention the community at the entrance of the temple. So various middling in the caste hierarchy, middling castes have temples along the side of the central Saraswat temple. And even lower than that, castes or communities considered to be lower than that have even smaller temples, smaller shrines. You can see this Rakho Gono is a shrine right here at the entrance of you look at the top left image, where you're looking at the lamp tower in front of the main temple, and at the side you can see this tiny little shrine, which is of a community of the village, Rakho Guno. Okay, and again you have the Maringan, which is embedded into the wall. So you have this kind of multi-shrine complexes, very common in Goa, and the architecture reflects the hierarchy of caste communities in that village. So as I said, the biggest, the wealthiest, and the most Goan temple forms are seen in the temples owned by the dominant Saraswat caste or other dominant groups like the Bhatts and the Ranis. These are all temples, big temples, owned purely by those three groups. There are, however, a few temples which are almost as grand, and they are owned by non-Brahmin communities, but they are fewer, but they do exist. But mostly with Saraswats as well, in the sense that Saraswats have managed to get themselves into the Mahajan community of practically every temple. And this, as historian Parag Parbo has explained, he says that it's because the Saraswats were the community in the 19th century that were the most literate, the most educated, and the most involved with the government. So therefore, when the government was regularizing, codifying, okay, notifying temple functions and details, it was the Saraswats who are part and parcel of that whole process. And that's why they were able to, you suddenly find that they're part of temples all over Goa, even in very tribal villages where you don't find any Saraswat at all. Still, they are part of the ownership of the temple. Okay. Then you have medium-sized temples, which tend to belong to locally dominant, at the village level, dominant communities, which do not have certain characteristics of the temple, like sometimes the dome, though sometimes they do have the dome.
We have to, can
Yes,
you
I'm
please
winding up. I'm winding up. So you have this, and then finally you have vernacular temples in especially Sangye, which have a lot of timber, and then you have the invisibilized shrines. And yes, with that I'll stop. I've stopped. Yeah, thank you.
Could you stop sharing the screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. I want to thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful, very rich presentation. I feel very fortunate that I was able to read some of your work before today, but to see it with the kind of field work you've done and the comparative work that you've put together for this presentation, I'm really grateful. While people gather their thoughts, I have a few questions I'd like to pose to you. Two of them, well, let me just begin with the first one. Across India, prior to the Vijayanagara period, Shilpa Shastras were developed either to codify existing temple architecture or architecture forms, doesn't have to be temples, other kinds of things, or were rewritten to justify transformations that were happening on the ground. For example, when the Rahman Prasada typology was invented to deal with mosque architecture in Gujarat, temple builders or local builders developing a terminology for building mosques in Gujarat. So is there any process that you can see in Konkani or Goan Portuguese of a regional architectural language that is not the anglicized Goan temple term that you've used? I'm not debating the use of that word right now, but I'm curious.
Not really. No, I really don't think so. I think that this temple architecture has been influenced by, to some extent, by temple architectural forms, not by writings, not so much by texts. I do know, and I know that scholars have pointed out that certain temples and certain writings about temples seem to have, well, if not informed the temples, at least documented the temple. It's a question mark whether the writing comes first or the temple comes first.
There was no Konkani word for the Goan Portuguese dome?
For the dome, yes, there is a word which I can't remember right now. But it's not. I think it's Gumbad. I think it is. Well, I'm not sure. Sorry, I can't remember. I don't think it's commonly used. I think a lot of people see there are a lot of English words which are used in Konkani now. So dome is very commonly said.
No, I'm talking about the historic past. So that might be an interesting.
No, I don't think so. In fact, I have not been able to come across any writing at all, any texts about the Goan temple, even in the 19th century, even by Lopesh Mendes. He documents it in a drawing, but he doesn't speak about it. He just says that it's a big pagode or it's a big temple. That's of course he's a Portuguese person, but nobody else is writing about it either. There are fights. There's documentation of fights which go on for years. Successive fights, but that's over control and so on. So I'm looking, in fact, in temple archives which is a difficult thing because they don't want to. These are privately owned, so they don't want people to have access. But I'm trying to look at temple archives to see whether they discuss the architecture as it's being rebuilt, as it's being either built or rebuilt. But so far, I've not found any discussion or any description of the architecture, except when it starts being looked at by Portuguese tourism brochures. They start describing it in the 1940s and 50s. Before that, nothing. Before that, it doesn't seem to exist in texts.
Are there any sort of receipts or patronage records or donation records
Yes.
from well, now we want to get rid of this thatched roof and we want to build something more permanent in this space. Do you have that kind of information as far as because who gives the money or makes that donation, whether it's this Mahajan community or the Sarasvats, that can impact probably what ends up getting built.
So I've been working with historians, meaning I'm in touch with a lot of historians who are working on temple histories, especially Parag Parbo has done some phenomenal, I mean, I think he's the only person really who has gone into depth of how temples have worked in terms of the social context, creating identities, creating power, land relations, and so on. And also some others who have also worked, some Portuguese scholars who have worked on temple histories. And there's lots of records of donations. Donation is a lot. Repair records are also there, but they say things like repairing the dome, repairing the roof, there was leakage, and so on. They don't mention a transformation so far. They don't. I'm looking for this. This is exactly what is something that's ongoing. And I'm trying to see whether you can find this any record of how, I mean, in Mangeshi at Priol, where you have those photographs, and the temple committee is very clear that the temple was built in the 1890s. They say that there is no record of why the architecture is the way it is. I mean, they agree that yes, somebody must have decided, and maybe there was some imitation of other things, but they claim that we have no record, and they've not yet allowed me to check their archives.
And who is the traditional community of builders? Is there a traditional, I mean, from the 19th century onwards, are there any groups that are the builders of temples, or are they just contractors who build houses, temples, anything?
There are records of Catholic masons and builder groups who were experienced in building churches, also working on temples, Hindu temples, in the 18th century, because there is some Jesuit letters complaining about this, that why should Catholic builders be working on these shrines? So there is that. Otherwise, I don't really know about builders in the 19th century. Right now, of course, it's a lot of Karnataka groups are coming in to build the new kind of temples. But about the Goan builders, we do know that church builders were also working on temples. That much we do know.
So I think that's an interesting possibility for you to consider, along with all the other wonderful points you brought up, which is that a lot of times architecture depends on what's familiar to the builder. So if you have Catholic builders working on temples as well, certain things will come to them easy, whereas trying to do a Goan Baroque dome for an architect from Karnataka or a temple builder from Karnataka or a contractor from Karnataka might be a bit tough. It's just a thought. I have another question to ask you. You talk so eloquently and powerfully about the way caste is spatialized in the Goan temple. Is there a connection? Was caste spatialized in the church, in the Goan church? And is there a connection between the way caste functioned in the architecture of the church and caste functioned in the architecture of the temple?
No, I don't think there is a connection within the architecture, okay, between the church and the temple in Goa. Caste exists in the actual functioning, in the sense how communities use the church. And also within the church, it was first, to be a priest, first of all, you could only be Portuguese or Italian or whatever earlier. And then you could only be a dominant caste person if you were a local. So caste functioned within the church a long time ago in this manner. And it also functioned in terms of the usage of the church, that although that you had, certain castes entering, the dominant castes entering from the main entrances of churches, and non-dominant castes apparently entering churches from relatively minor or side entrances. Similarly, the prominent places within the church seating was for the dominant castes, and so on and so forth. So the way the church was used, there was definitely, because caste entered Christianity in Goa almost at least not directly challenged. It was indirectly challenged in the sense that the very practice of Catholicism and then the cosmopolitanism that entered Goa during Portuguese rule challenged the hierarchy. So caste is exists in Goan Christianity for sure, and existed in the church functioning for sure, but it isn't as formalized and connected. I mean, it's definitely not connected to religion. It's not connected to religious theory the way it is connected to religious theory here in Hinduism. So there's just no comparison of it. That in the large Goan temples, for example, there is an intricate detailing out of what caste does what. A lot of the village communities, the village caste communities, are involved in the functioning and the maintenance and everything of the main village temples. So certain castes are doing cleaning, certain castes are doing gardening, certain castes are beating drums, certain castes are singing songs, and there are names of all these castes. Certain castes are washing places, and so on. So these are village communities who are involved in the temples. They have been involved for a long time. They're known as the sevekaris, servants. There's a term for them, the temple sevekaris, and they are in the regulations made by the Portuguese in the 19th century. So there are temple owners and there are temple sevekaris, starting with the Brahmins on top, who are in the best position, and they all are living on temple land. But the bhatts, who are the priests, are living on the best, have the largest houses. They are very large houses close to the biggest of the temples. And then the others have a hierarchy of domestic size, size of residence, and also further and further away from the temple. So it's very formalized and historical, and laid down, absolutely as it's rock solid even now. It's interesting that even now, in all these fights, when certain middling communities have got control over a couple of temples, they maintain the caste operation of those temples, because they say that is what the temple is. That is how the temple has always functioned. It's a tradition. It's laid down by God, basically. How can we challenge it? I asked somebody, how can we challenge it? So I don't think you can consider, you can relate the way caste operates in the Catholic Church architecture with its operation in Hindu temple architecture in Goa.
And finally, because you've spoken so much about the idea of ownership, which involves some kind of legal status, could you talk a little bit about the Goan temple, if possible, and Napoleonic law, which is operative in Goa?
Sorry, I didn't get that. Napoleonic law. What do you mean by that?
I'm sorry, the connection isn't it Napoleonic law is the law in terms of families and stuff? It's Napoleonic law in Goa, right?
You mean what is
For property ownership and for property.
Yeah,
for property ownership and those kinds of things. It's Napoleonic law that dominates there. So how does that connect to temples and temple ownership?
I presume you're talking about the civil codes and the family codes that operate in Goa.
Right.
So, it's very patriarchal, and in fact, there have been demands in recent times that that ownership of temples should should become aware of gender rights, and women should be allowed to enter temples to become Mahajans. Right now, it's you have to be a male descendant of the Mahajan families to be an owner of the temple. To be the owner community is very large now. It's extremely large because these families have proliferated. So there are, I mean, hundreds of members, and many of them do not actually play a role. It's just that they can go into the sanctum and do some rituals there. They don't play a role in the actual control, but in the daily control. But there have been demands from among them, the liberal voices from among them, that women should be allowed to become Mahajans just the way that they own property in the rest of Goa. They inherit property in the rest of Goa. So they should be allowed to be Mahajans. There's also been some criticism of these rules, like widows. Widows cannot enter the temple. There's a rule. Widows cannot enter. I mean, it's broken, of course, by a lot of people today, but it was a rule. Widows cannot enter. People in their menses cannot enter. There were these rules. So there are some people within the Mahajans who feel all this should be challenged. And ownership, definitely, there's some demand for gender equality, but there has been no demand from within the Mahajans of breaking the caste laws of these temples, the caste barrier, and, for example, allowing anybody to do those rituals which can only be done within the sanctum.
So we have a couple of questions that have come through in our chat. First one is from Fiona Bucky, who asks about the ASI. So there are similar refurbs going on in the north during the same periods, and often ASI are involved. Were the Goan temples too modern to be of interest to the ASI? Are they not as involved? And I just want to group that with another question, somewhat related. Jaya Kanoya asks, are there records of land grants to or for temples?
Yeah.
Questions.
So the ASI is not involved in any temple in Goa. It has not shown. Except the Tambi Surla, that Kadamba monument, which is an ASI monument. I think, but otherwise the local archaeology, the Goa Directorate of Archaeology and Archives, which is the local body, that has got some temples as protected monuments. In fact, it had a lot more temples in the 1960s when this body was formed. It had a lot of these old temples as protected monuments, but these temples have been fighting to get themselves unprotected. The owners have been fighting, and they've been very successful. So right now there are only about 5 temples that are protected under the state laws. In fact, I think even the Tambi Surla, it was considered under the ASI, but I think it's still under the state law. So there are only 5 temples which are protected under the state law, and even those are not really being protected. I mean, I can see a lot of renovations happening.
Amita, your camera is shaking and your head is disappearing. Could you maybe hold your computer still? Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah. So no, so Fiona, they're not protected, and the ASI is not really involved. And in fact, we are now heading into a situation where the archaeology bodies, given this current political context that we're in, they're more interested in the temples that were destroyed and no longer exist. So they're protecting those sites of temple destruction rather than trying to protect these temples. So these temples have just not been recognized as of any importance, And now in this current political climate where the Goa government and the central government is trying to downplay the Catholic history of Goa and it's trying very, very, openly to make Goa a tourism site for Hindu temple tourism. It says that Goa will be a site of Hindu temple tourism. So they are lavishing funds on temples, but on their renovation. So you have funds for breaking down temples and rebuilding new temples. That's part of the government tourism policy. They call it temple tourism. That's one of their big projects, temple tourism. So they're just renovating those areas out of all recognition. And the archaeology department is really not really involved at all.
So our final question is from Kevin Fernandez, who asks, is there any impact of Portuguese policies on the practice of Hinduism in Estado da India on the creation of the Goan temple as we understand it today? If so, how? And if you have a short answer to that, that would be great, but no pressure.
I'll just say that there was a transformation of Portuguese policies regarding Hinduism in the 18th century, which is also the century when when Goa got the new conquests. So the way in which they looked at the new conquest was very different from the way they had looked at the old conquest, where Hinduism was frowned upon, you can say, in many ways, and almost every Hindu temple, Brahmanical temple, disappeared. Almost, I would say, not all, but many of them disappeared. In the new conquest, the policy was all traditional customs and usages will be protected. So this is also the reason why from the 18th century to the 19th century, these temples actually expand under the blessings of the Portuguese government. They expand, they become even more powerful. Okay, and the government protects the rights and privileges of those who are involved in these temples, although there are fights. So that's why then the codification of the regulations and so on, there are fights. But the government's policy is that liberal one of, it's that enlightenment one of all, we are with, so much so that Hindu communities in the old conquests, as some scholars have pointed out, Hindu communities demanded that they be allowed to follow the same laws which are now being implemented, which are now being accepted in the new conquests. Like, for example, they didn't want the Portuguese, the civil code to be applied to them. They wanted to be allowed to not leave their property to their daughters, and so on and so forth. Sorry, that was too long.
Okay, so thank you so much, Amita. This was amazing and entirely new and undocumented material that's vanishing before our eyes. So we really appreciate this work. So please join me in thanking Amita Kanekar for this beautiful lecture today.
Thanks a
And
lot.
Lovely.
yeah, and a great first in the series of the new year. And I just want to remind everybody that our next lecture is on March 22nd at the same time. And the lecture's title is Mughal Burhanpur, Dynamic Urbanism at the Edge of Empire. That falls within a weird time when there's a time change in some parts of the world and not in other parts of the world. So please just check your clocks. And if you're not getting the links, feel free to email Neil. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your days. We have one last question that concludes the official session, but I just wanted to have this question answered before we close out. Jaya Kanoria asks about the Goan civil code and gender. Is the Goan civil code gender neutral?
It is, it is more general. Sorry, again, I'm moving my laptop. It is more gender neutral than I think civil codes in British India. But as scholars have pointed out, especially Albertina Almeida has done a lot of work on this. She points out how subtly it favors males. It apparently, is egalitarian towards males and females owning property, inheriting property, controlling property, but through various subtle ways, it does favor males. So she's done this critical assessment of the Goan civil code. And in fact, there have been Goan legal bodies and women's associations who have demanded for so many years, they've been demanding reforms in the Goan civil code. So it's not that, it's not such an ideal code as some people imagine. But it has a lot of positives in it, yes.
Thank you, Amita. That was wonderful. So I hope you have a wonderful evening and thank you again for this lecture. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Take care.
Take care. Bye. Thank you, Neil.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.